week we have the great schus of reading Vayakhel. And as everyone knows, Vayakhel to a certain extent is a repeat of Truma and the broad description of the Mishkan and how the things were donated, etc. But it's not a complete repetition of Truma. And the Ramban has many, many fascinating insights. Most of the ones we'll do are from the beginning of this week's parsha, but really there are insights all over the place. So starts the Torah. Vayakhel Moshe kol adat Bnei Yisrael vayomer alehem eila hadivarim asher tziva Hashem la'asot otam. Okay, so Moshe gathers all of Ka'al Yisrael. Now, interestingly, for the Ramban, this is a problem. Because if you look at the end of last week's parsha, Vayomer Hashem Moshe k'tav l'cha t'advarim ha'ela ki al pi advarim ha'ela karati itcha brit vet Yisrael, right, is a whole thing. And then he gathers Bnei Yisrael again. Va'achareichem nigshu kol Bnei Yisrael vayitzavem eit kol asher diber Hashem ito b'har Sinai vayichal Moshe midaber, right? And then it starts again, Vayakhel Moshe. So for Rashi, this isn't a problem, because Rashi thinks the description at the end of last week's parsha repeats over and over again. This is how Moshe Rabbeinu taught Klal Yisrael the Torah. But for the Ramban, last week's parsha is a real event. And so why would he have to regather Klal Yisrael? And the Ramban deals with it. The first Ramban on the parsha says, Yichlol kol adat b'nei Yisrael. First thing he says is, Vayakhel Moshe kol adat b'nei Yisrael. Why such an inclusive term? Ha'anashim ve'hanashim, both men and women. Ki lahem hitnadvu bimlechat hamishkan. It's a theme that we'll repeat and we'll see it again today. The Ramban says women had an equal part in the building of the Mishkan as the men. Mostly for practical reasons, but nevertheless. So it seems like they gathered together again because this time it included the women. But what's really going on? So he says, V'hinei, Moshe, Achar shetziva le'aharon v'hanisiyim v'chol b'nei Yisrael ha'anashim kol asher diber Hashem ito b'har Sinai. Right? Yesterday, Moshe gathered all the men and all the leaders of Klal Yisrael and told them what HaKadosh Baruch Hu had told them at Har Sinai. Acharei shvor haluchot. After the destruction of the luchot, v'natan al parav ha'masveh, and he wore a mask because his face was radiant. Now, chazar v'tziva v'hikilu elav kol ha'eda anashim v'nashim v'taf. Now is the beginning of the building of the Mishkan. Meaning, yesterday, at the end of Kitisa, is the end of the story of the Egel and the end of the story of the sin of Klal Yisrael and their forgiveness. Now starts again what was supposed to be before the Chet HaEgel. Remember, the Ramban thinks, Yesh mukdam u'mulchar b'Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us to build a Mishkan before we sinned with the Egel. V'yitachen, says the Ramban, Shehaya ze biyom macharat ridito. This was really the day after Moshe came down. He came down on Yom Kippur. Everything that happened last week happened on Yom Kippur. The day after, he gathered all of Bnei Yisrael, anashim v'nashim v'taf, v'amar lekulam inyan hamishkan, asher nitztaveh bo mitchila kodem shvor haluchot. Now he's commanding them what God told him to do before he destroyed the luchos, before the sin of the Egel. Again, the Ramban believes that God commanded Moshe on Har Sinai the first time to build a Mishkan. He never got around to telling them because the Chet HaEgel interrupted. Okay, now that that's all done, now that that's all forgiven, now that that's all, if not forgotten, but at least on some level forgiven, Moshe Rabbeinu starts again at the beginning. And he starts telling him about the Mishkan. The Ramban doesn't think that Truma actually involves Moshe telling Klal Yisrael anything. Truma is what God told Moshe on Har Sinai the first time before Chet HaEgel. Vayakhel is Moshe coming down from Har Sinai as if Chet HaEgel never took place and commanding Bnei Yisrael in the mitzvahs that he was given in Parshas Truma. Now, why does it have to be repeated here? And this is an important point in the Ramban. He says, Kevan shenitrat selahem hakadosh baruch hu V'natan lo haluchot shniot. Right? God has forgiven us, and He gave us a second luchos. V'karati mo brit chadasha, and He entered a new covenant, the covenant based on the Yud Gimel Midos with Moshe Rabbeinu. Sheyelech Hashem b'kirbam, and He forgave us, and He said, I'm not going to send a malach. I'll travel with you as you requested. V'hinei chazar likadmutam ula ahavat kilulatam. Says the Ramban, Bnei Yisrael returned to their relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu as if they were newlyweds, as if the Chet HaEgel hadn't happened. Uviyadua shetihiyeh shchinato b'tocham ki inyan shetzivah tchila. And obviously then, the implication in the Ramban is that God did not command Moshe Rabbeinu a second time after Chet HaEgel to build a Mishkan. Moshe Rabbeinu understood, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgave us, and if the relationship we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Va'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, so that's what I should do now, right? It's a significant step. Moshe Rabbeinu is reestablishing the covenant in Parshas Vayakhel that we had abrogated in Parshas Kitisa. So it's a significant step. Right, so the Ramban really says two different things. The first thing is Moshe Rabbeinu had to command Klal Yisrael about the Mishkan because he never did it originally. But the deeper point is that Moshe Rabbeinu is reestablishing the covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that having forgiven us in Parshas Kitisa, Moshe Rabbeinu is now reestablishing our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the original Va'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham is now being reestablished in Parshas Vayakhel. Okay, that's the first Ramban on the Parsha. I think it's a significant one. Then comes a strange pasuk, or strange psukim. We'll read again. Vayakhel Moshe et kol hadat b'nei Yisrael vayomer alehem eile hadvarim asher tzivah Adonai la'asot otam. Sheishet yamim te'aseh melacha vayom hashvi'i yeh lachem kodesh Shabbat Shabbaton la'Adonai kol ha'oseh bo melacha yumat. Right? Now it's true, Shabbos pops up in all kinds of places in the Torah, and as the Ramban has told us before, you don't always need a limud. HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves Shabbos. Shabbos is really, really important. So he emphasizes it by repeating it. But something's going on here. And here, I think, is a significant point in the Parshanut of the Ramban, even if he doesn't really say it. First of all, what's the first pasuk? Vayakhel Moshe et kol hadat b'nei Yisrael vayomer alehem eile hadivarim asher tzivah Hashem la'asot otam. What's the subject of that pasuk? So I think most of us would say that it's talking about Shabbos, right? And what we learn out from the smichut haparshiot of Shabbos and the Mishkan, as we all know, is that the binyan hamishkan is not docha Shabbos, and binyan beis hamikdash is not docha Shabbos, and we learn that from the smichas haparshios. So Ramban agrees with the lesson, but not so much with how we learn it. Let's read the Ramban. Amar eile hadivarim asher tzivah Hashem la'asot al melechet hamishkan. Says the Ramban, the first pasuk is not talking about Shabbos. It's not smichos haparshios. The first pasuk, eile hadivarim, the plural of the first pasuk, is talking about the plural of all of our responsibilities and all of our obligations to build the Mishkan. So we have eile hadivarim, okay, al hamishkan v'chol kelav v'chol avodato. The plural of the pasuk is because it's talking about building the Mishkan. So now what's the flow of the psukim? What's the next pasuk? Sheishet yamim te'aseh melacha. So says the Ramban, v'hiktim hashabat lomar ki sheishet yamim te'aseh melacha eile hadivarim v'lo bayom hashvi'i shehu kadosh l'Hashem. And the next pasuk comes to tell me, yes, you're supposed to build a Mishkan, but not on Shabbos. Umikan she'ein melechet hamishkan doche Shabbat. So the Ramban says this is where we learn it from. For some reason, he wants to point out the following: V'lo mi midrash ach k'mo sheperashti b'seder kitisa. Right? Rashi says The reason we know that you don't build a Mishkan on Shabbos is because it says build a Mishkan. Achet Shabbatotai tishmoru pasuk in Kitisa. So Rashi says all achin v'rakim, like the Gemara says, are coming to exclude. So there it's coming to exclude the fact that we don't build a Mishkan on Shabbos. Says Ramban, no. I disagree with that limud. We learn it from Parshas Vayakhel. But here's a significant point, says the Ramban. We don't learn it because the parshas are next to each other. We learn it because literally the parsha of Shabbos interrupts the parsha of building the Mishkan. The first pasuk, Eile hadivarim asher tziva Hashem lasot otam, that's talking about the Mishkan. The second pasuk of Sheshet Yamim Te'asem Malacha, that's talking about Shabbos. Shabbos comes and interrupts the flow to teach me that the Mishkan is not Docha Shabbos. Okay, this happens to be a shita of the Ramban in other places. I think it's in Amor, in Parshas Amodos, which is interrupted by Shabbos. The Ramban always, I can't say always, but the Ramban often reads those psukim not as smichos haparshios, but as actual interruptions. The first pasuk is talking about building the Mishkan. The second pasuk interrupts building the Mishkan with another din, a din about Shabbos. Then the parsha goes back to building the Mishkan. It's not simply smichos haparshas, the two parshas are next to each other. It's that one interrupts the other. And when one interrupts the other, says the Ramban, you have no choice but to learn something significant from that interruption. And in this case, the Ramban feels strongly that the thing we learn from the interruption is that Binyan HaMishkan is not Docha Shabbos. Okay, that I think is significant in the Parsha of the Ramban, even if less significant in terms of how we read the Psukim. Now we come to a really fascinating Ramban. We're in the same parak Lamed Hey, Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Says the Torah, Vayavo'u kol ish asher nisha'o libo, v'chol asher nodva rucho oto heviu et trumat Adonai limlechet ol moed u'l'chol avodato u'levigdei hakodesh. The Ramban, being a close reader of Psukim, notes there are two different phrases here that are used here and in other places. There's anashim asher nisha'o libo. How would we translate nisha'o libo? Raise up their hearts. And then there are anashim asher nodva rucho. Their spirit volunteered. And the Ramban thinks there's a significant difference between one and the other. Says the Ramban, Vayavo kol ish asher nisha'o libo. Nisha'o libo means ala chachamim ha'usim b'melacha. That's actually talking about the artisans who were sitting there working with the gold and the silver and all the materials. Va'amar kain, ki lo matzinu al hamitnadvim nisiyut leiv. First of all, he says linguistically, we don't find the volunteers who are working to build the Mishkan, that we don't find the phrase nisiyut leiv with them. Aval yazkir bahem nidivut. But there's something about their spirit of volunteerism. V'ta'am asher nisha'o libo likarva ala melacha. Now we come to a basic understanding of the Ramban about the Avdus in Mitzrayim and about the building of the Mishkan. He says, Ki lo haya bahem shelamadat hamelachot ha'ela mimelamed o mi she'imein bahem yadav klal. Says the Ramban, in Mitzrayim, we were field hands. We did hard labor. We carried heavy things. We moved things. We pushed things. We built big things. We were not artisans, none of us. There was no one in Mitzrayim who worked with gold, who worked with silver, who worked with fancy, expensive materials that were necessary to build a Mishkan, which is another way of saying there was no one who you would expect to step up to say, when Tzal says, who knows how to build a menorah? The answer is none of us know how to build a menorah. We never worked with silver in our lives. We don't know how it works. Who knows how to build a shulchan? We don't know how to work with gold. Says the Ramban, that's exactly what's going on. No one knew how to do it. Nevertheless, aval matza b'tivo sheyada la'asot kein, vayigba libo b'darkei Hashem, lavo lifnei Moshe lomar lo, ani e'aseh kol asher Adoni dover. Says the Ramban, there are two groups of people who essentially build the Mishkan. There's Kalish Asher Nadva Rucho, whose spirit moved him, who donated, who donates money. It's the same thing we see now. There are people with generosity of spirit, right? And we need people like that, and that's really, really important. But says the Ramban, it was the second group that was more impressive. The second group were people who Bezalel came and said, okay, this is what we need to build the Mishkan. Who knows how to do that? Now, the real truth is, no one knew how to do that. No one was trained to do that. No one went to school. No one got a degree. No one was an apprentice. There was no one. But what there were people who in that moment were inspired and thought to themselves, you know what? I can do that. Now, was it a miracle? Was it some kind of, so it was not a kind of miracle. It wasn't like HaKadosh Baruch Hu moved their hands and therefore they built amazing things in the Mishkan. But they were, the English word that comes to mind is they were inspired. They saw it and they felt like they could do it. And unlike, the rest of us grown-ups who think, I've never done it in my life, I'll probably mess it up. They were the opposite. They were like, I've never done it in my life, but I really think I can do it. It's a form of Ruach HaKodesh. It's a form of divine inspiration. It's not a miracle, it's something less than that. But it's something much more than just being inspired. And says the Torah, a person says to himself, Ani e'aseh kol asher Adoni dover. I'm inspired. Ukvar iskarti zeh b'seder ha'acher. The Ramban in Kitisa, when he explains the greatness of Bezalel, says, and even if Bezalel learned some of these things in Mitzrayim, which he thinks is not true, but all of them, carpentry and woodwork and goldsmithery, or whatever the word is, and silver works and bronze work, there's no way anybody could have mastered all of those trades. But he was inspired to do it, and therefore he stepped up and he did it. Okay. V'hinei amar, sheba'u lifnei Moshe kol asher nisha'o libo likarva al hamelacha, v'chol asher nadva rucho heviu hatruma. Yes, you needed the people with generosity of spirit. You needed the people to give money, to give raw materials. That was a necessary part of the Mishkan. But then you needed people to believe in themselves. A long, long time ago, maybe in the 80s, there was a series of bestsellers by Robert Fulghum. The first one was called Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And he tells a fascinating story. He says, when he goes into a kindergarten and he asks the children who knows how to sing, he says, pretty much everyone raises their hands. He says, when he goes to a university and he stands in front of a class, a university class, and he says, who knows how to sing, very few people raise their hands. So we've lost our inspiration over time. In the time of the building of the Mishkan, there were a group of people who thought to themselves, yes, I can do this. They were the people who had Ruach HaKodesh, and they were the people who built the Mishkan. The Mishkan was more than just the end result of artisanship, right? Later, we won't do the Ramban, but on the Ramban that discusses why Bezalel built the Aron himself, he says it took a higher level of inspiration. Now, the Aron is not that fancy. It's just a bunch of boxes. Why would it take, Bezalel and not the regular volunteers to build it? The sense you get is that for the Ramban, the Kalim of the Mishkan were imbued with the Kavana and the inspiration of the people who built them. And if I built it, it would not have been as spiritual as if Bezalel built it, because he had Ruach HaKodesh, not the Ruach HaKodesh that gave him the ability to do things. The Ruach HaKodesh that gave him the inspiration to believe that he understands what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants and that he could do it. That's the difference between Nadva Libo, which is a great level, and which we need today also, but Nisha'o Libo, that's literally your heart grew, your heart became taller, your heart became bigger, and you were able to do things that on the facts, probably you should not have been able to do. Okay, that's a beautiful Ramban. Let's keep going. The next pasuk, the Torah says as follows. It's a strange pasuk. Vayavohu ha'anashim al hanashim kol nediv lev heviu chak v'nezem v'tabaz v'chumaz kol kli zahav v'chalisha shahinif tenufat zahav ladonai. Okay, what does the pasuk mean? Vayavohu ha'anashim al hanashim. So here the Ramban returns to women, and he makes what I think is an obvious point, but very, very insightful one. Ba'avur ki hanidava batachshitinhi mitsuya eitzel hanashim yoter. Who's likely to donate gold and silver to the Mishkan? Ramban says the women. Women had earrings, women had jewelry, women had expensive things. So he says it makes complete sense that the women donated first. V'chulan hayu lahen uparku nizmehem v'tabotehem miyad. They took them off immediately. They said, Moshe, here it is. Uba'ut chila. Right, we have a beautiful medrash. Maybe we'll do it next week, about the kiyar and the kano and how it was made from the mirrors that the women used them. They were the first people to donate, says the Ramban. They stepped up immediately. V'ha'anashim asher nimtzu'u lahem heviu imahem. The men also brought, but after the women. Ki ta'am al hanashim, again, vayavo ha'anashim al hanashim, shehein hayu sham barishona. Meaning when the men came, the women were already there. They were already donating. V'ha'anashim nitfilu lahan. And so the men, they added on to what the women donated. V'chein, says the Ramban, this is the type of way the Torah describes the situations. V'chein, nacha aram al Ephraim. What does it mean, nacha aram al Ephraim? Ki hamilchama hahila Ephraim. It was Ephraim's war. Aram joined in. Says the Ramban, same thing with respect to the Mishkan. It was the women who primarily donated. They donated first, and my sense is they donated the most. And the men also brought, but literally also, not primarily, but additionally. And that's the lashon of vayavohu anashim al hanashim. Okay, let's do one more Ramban. One more Ramban which kind of describes the process and something unique about the building of the Mishkan, and something I think historic in terms of fundraising. Says the Torah, if I could find it, in Perek Lamed Vav, Pasuk Aleph, Va'asa b'tzalel va'ahaliyav v'chol ish chacham lev asher natan Hashem chachmo tzvuna b'hem aladat lasot et kol melechet avodat hakodesh v'chol asher tziva Hashem. Okay, they did all of the work. And then the Torah continues, Vayikra Moshe b'tzalel ve'al aliyav ve'al kol ish chacham lev asher natan Adonai chachma b'libo kol asher nisha'o libo l'kavah la'melacha lasot otah. That phrase again, Pasuk Gimel. Vayikchu milifnei Moshe eit kol hatiruma asher heviu Bnei Yisrael limlechet avodat hakodesh lasot otah vehem heviu elav od nidava baboker. What's the process of donating and how does it work? So says the Ramban, Vayikchu milifnei Moshe hine biyom echad heviu kol hanidava hazot el ohel moed shehu shel Moshe. The Ramban says most of the stuff was brought in one day. Where was it brought? To the Ohel Moed. The Ramban understands that when it talks about a place in front of Moshe, that means the Ohel Moed. V'hachachamim lakchu bo bayom milifanav ubemacharat bahashkama v'chein b'sheni. Right? So the Ramban says the workers came to the Ohel Moed and they would take the raw materials that had been given to Moshe Rabbeinu. The first morning, the second morning, maybe there was a third morning, I'm not sure. Heviu elav od ela halo nidava V'hu tziva lahavi oto el ha'umanim. Right? So the people donated the raw material to the Ohel Moed. It was like a warehouse. And then Moshe said, okay, the umanim who need the raw material should take it from in front of me. Ad she'amru lo shehem marbim lahavi v'haita dayam v'hoter. Until the artisans came to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, Marbim ha'am lahavi midei ha'avodah. We don't need this much work, right? Marbim ha'am lahavi midei ha'avodah la'melacha asher tziva Hashem lasot ota. And then for the first time, maybe the only time in the history of fundraising, Vayitzav Moshe vayaviru kol b'machaneh lemor ish v'isha al ya'asu od melacha l'tumat hakodesh vayikaleh ha'am mehavi. Right? They didn't pretend that, okay, this was the target, but we want more money. We're raising. No, Moshe Rabbeinu said it's enough. There's a finite amount of donations we need to build the Mishkan. We've reached that point. Enough. And the Ramban explains. Ad shamru she'em marbim lahavi v'haita dayam v'hoter. It's too much. So the Ramban wants to know, why doesn't the Torah in Pekudei tell us about the extra donations? So he says, V'lo haya hayitaron davar chashuv sheyisaper beparshat ele Pekudei ma'asubo. They didn't have to explain to us what they did with the extra donations. Ulai haya munach ba'ohel lechazek bo at bedek hamishkan. Maybe they kept it in the ohel when something broke and had to be fixed in the Mishkan, so they used this extra material. O la'asot ba klei sharet kasher yasu b'mikdash b'motarot. Or they had to make additional kelim, as happened in the Beit HaMikdash. V'hizkir hakatuv marbim ha'am lahavi. Now, why is this so emphasized? Okay, it's true, it's a one-time deal that they brought too much. But the Ramban wants to know, why is it emphasized in the Torah? Okay, so they had too much. L'shabeach et ha'am ha'mivi'im b'nidvatam. First of all, the first praise goes to Bnei Yisrael, who were so quick and so generous of spirit that they donated way more than needed immediately. Second, ulifa'er hachachamim b'ne'emunatam. And second of all, to praise the artisans and the people working in the Mishkan, who immediately said, we don't need more. And third, v'gam hanagid aleihem. Who's the nagid aleihem? That's Moshe Rabbeinu. To praise Moshe. Mishubach bezeh shehavir kol b'machaneh limon'am. To tell him it's enough. Ki ein lo chayfetz b'kaspam uzehavam ka'asher hamoshlim ba'amam. Moshe is not like a regular ruler, which is, I want to amass wealth. Keep bringing, I'll find something to do with it. Moshe is not like that at all. Kinyan shamar, lo chamor echad mehem nasati. Moshe Rabbeinu is not interested in any way in making himself rich. And when they've reached their fundraising goal, and when they have enough, Moshe Rabbeinu says, I don't want gold in my tent. I don't want more things here. I don't need it. It's such a musar haskel for, our times. Maybe people would donate more if they believed that organizations would give back if they had too much, that organizations weren't trying to amass wealth and simply were trying to meet needs. Says the Ramban, that's what we learn from Vayaviru kol b'machaneh lemor, right? We have too much. Moshe Rabbeinu, Klal Yisrael, the people who worked in the Mishkan, all incredibly honest, all incredibly willing to do what they had to do, but all, when necessary, when they have enough, they stop and they say, we have enough. Okay, so what do we see today? We saw a Ramban that basically situates Parshas Vayakhel as what happens after the Chet HaEgel, and as what happens after Moshe Rabbeinu was told about the Mishkan. He's now reinvigorating our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even though he wasn't told to do so, because that's what we need to do at this point, right? The Ramban's Parshanut on the Mishkan and Shabbat, that the first pasuk is talking about the Mishkan, and the second pasuk literally interrupts the flow, and that's how we learn that the Mishkan is not Docha Shabbos. It's not just that they're next to each other, it's that one interrupts the other. The amazing Ramban's difference between nisha'o libo and Nidva Rucho, right? All people are generous of spirit, but nisha'o libo means a person sees the work that needs to be done as is inspired and feels like I could do it. Okay, and that's the difference in the Mishkan. The women did most of the donating. The men just came after them and as a supplement to them, not as the main part. And finally, Vayakhel mifnei Moshe, that all the raw material was brought to Moshe Rabbeinu at the Ohel Moed. Again, you have to remember, before the Mishkan, the Ohel Moed was Moshe's tent, which is slightly outside of the Ma'achana, where he had put it during the sin of the Chet HaEgel. They donated there. Then Moshe gave the materials to the artisans who needed to build the Mishkan. And it was Moshe and it was the artisans who came to Moshe and said, Marbim ha'am lahavi, we have too much. And Moshe Rabbeinu then, Vayaviru kol ma'achane lemor, pointing out what an honest effort this whole thing was, and that there was no effort of Moshe, God forbid, to make himself rich at the expense of Klal Yisrael, even though at that point Klal Yisrael was willing to donate more and more and more. Okay, that's it for today. Shabbat shalom to everyone, and see you next week. Yashikach.